The bitter December wind howled across the Arizona plains as Lillian Davis staggered through the darkness, each ragged breath visible in the moonlight. Blood trickled down her temple, mingling with tears as she fled blindly through the scrubland outside Tombstone. Behind her lay the shattered remains of the life she'd foolishly built with Edward Caldwell, wealthy mine owner, respected businessman. And behind closed doors, a monster whose cruelty knew no bounds. The thin cotton of her once fine dress offered no protection against the biting cold of 1883. Her fingers had long since gone numb, her feet bleeding inside delicate shoes never meant for such desperate flight. The bruises on her ribs made each breath agony, but Lillian pushed forward, knowing that stopping meant death. Tonight, she had finally fought back, and Edward's promise to put her in the ground rang in her ears. When she stumbled upon the small cattle camp, Lillian nearly collapsed from relief. The small campfire's glow promised warmth, but also danger. Strangers in these parts could be worse than the cold. Still, with no other choice, she approached cautiously, her entire body trembling. Bent over the fire, a broad-shouldered figure worked a coffee pot. As she drew closer, a twig snapped beneath her foot, and the man spun with impressive speed, his hand moving to his holster. "Who goes there?" His voice was deep, rough from trail dust. Lillian stepped into the firelight, swaying on her feet. "Please," was all she managed before her legs gave way. Strong arms caught her before she hit the ground. Through half-closed eyes, she glimpsed a weathered face framed by sandy brown hair, concern evident in blue eyes that studied her with alarm. "Madam, you're hurt," he said, gently lowering her to sit on a bedroll near the fire. "He'll kill me if he finds me," Lillian whispered, terror giving her strength to clutch at the stranger's shirt. "Please, I can't go back." The cowboy's expression hardened as he took in her battered appearance. Without hesitation, he shrugged out of his heavy sheepskin coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. The sudden warmth made her dizzy. "Nobody's taking you anywhere you don't want to go," he said firmly. "I'm Bryce O'Malley. You're safe now." Lillian didn't believe him, couldn't afford to, but the coat smelled of leather, horse, and wood smoke, and it was the first kindness she'd felt in longer than she cared to remember. "Lillian," she managed, teeth chattering. "Lillian Davis." "Miss Davis," Bryce said, pouring coffee into a tin cup. "You drink this while I tend those cuts. Then you can tell me who did this, and why I shouldn't ride into town and put a bullet in him right now." The heat of the cup stung Lillian's frozen fingers, but she clutched it desperately. "He's too powerful. Everyone in Tombstone answers to Edward Caldwell." Bryce's eyes narrowed. "The mine owner heard of him." He dampened a clean bandana with water from his canteen and gently dabbed at the cut on her temple. "Married to him, are you?" "Nearly was. Tomorrow was to be the wedding." A bitter laugh escaped her. "He said he wanted to give me a preview of married life tonight, when I refused." She gestured weakly to her injuries. Bryce's jaw tightened, but his hands remained gentle as he cleaned her wounds. "Bastards like that don't deserve to breathe the same air as decent folks. He has the marshal in his pocket, the mayor too. I don't answer to either." Bryce checked his Winchester rifle and the Colt at his hip. "You rest here, I'll keep watch." "You don't understand," Lillian said desperately. "He'll come with men. He'll kill you." Bryce smiled grimly. "Not my first fight, Miss Davis, but if it eases your mind, we'll move camp before dawn. I'm headed north to my ranch near Prescott. You're welcome to ride along until you figure your next step." Lillian stared at him, searching for deceit, for the trap she'd learned to expect from men. Finding none, she pulled his coat tighter around herself. "Why would you help me? You don't know me." Bryce added wood to the fire, his face half illuminated in the dancing light. "My mother fled a man like yours when I was just a boy. Not everybody looked the other way. A stranger helped us start over, he shrugged. Sometimes that's all anybody needs, a coat against the cold and a fresh start. Sleep overtook Lillian despite her fear, the combination of exhaustion and the relative safety of Bryce's camp proving too powerful to resist. When she awoke, dawn was just breaking, and Bryce had already packed most of their meager camp. "Heard riders about an hour back," he explained quietly, helping her to her feet. "Time we moved on." He led her to where 2 horses waited, a sturdy bay gelding and a dappled mare. "Ever ridden astride, Miss Davis?" Lillian shook her head. Coming from Philadelphia 3 years ago to live with her uncle after her parents' death, she'd only ever ridden side saddle, and rarely at that. No shame in it. Cinnamon here is gentle as they come. He helped her onto the mare, arranging his coat around her legs for warmth and modesty. "We'll need to get you proper clothes when we can, but this'll do for now." As they rode away from the camp, Lillian cast one last glance toward Tombstone, the town just visible in the distance. 3 years of her life gone, her few possessions abandoned. Yet all she felt was relief until the sound of hoofbeats in the distance sent ice through her veins. "Bryce," she whispered fearfully. He nodded, having already heard. "There's a ravine about half a mile ahead. We'll cut through there and lose them in the high country." They urged their horses faster, Lillian clinging desperately to the saddle horn. Her whole body ached from yesterday's beating and the unaccustomed riding, but fear kept her upright. The ravine appeared ahead, a jagged cut through the red rock. Bryce led them down a nearly invisible trail, the horses picking their way carefully over loose stone. Behind them, shouts echoed their pursuers had spotted them. "Keep going," Bryce instructed, swinging down from his horse. "Follow this trail. It opens up about a mile in. Wait for me there." "What are you doing?" Lillian asked, panicked. Bryce checked his rifle, making sure they don't follow. His eyes softened momentarily. "Go on now. I'll be right behind you." Against every instinct screaming at her to stay with her protector, Lillian nodded and urged Cinnamon forward. The mare seemed to understand the urgency and moved steadily along the narrow path. The sound of gunfire erupted behind her, echoing off the stone walls. Lillian flinched but kept riding, trusting Bryce's instructions. Minutes that felt like hours passed before the ravine widened into a small, sheltered clearing. She reined in the mare, heart pounding as she strained to hear anything beyond the hammering of her own pulse. More gunshots, then silence. Lillian's hands shook as she gripped the reins, terrified that she'd just witnessed the death of her unlikely savior. Then came the welcome sound of hoofbeats, and Bryce appeared, riding hard. Relief flooded through her until she noticed the dark stain spreading on his left arm. "You're hurt," she cried as he reached her. Bryce grimaced. "Just a graze. Those boys aren't much for shooting, thank the Lord." He glanced back the way they'd come. 2 of them turned back. The other one won't be reporting to Caldwell or anyone else. The implication was clear. Lillian swallowed hard, nodding. "We should tend your arm." "Not here. They'll bring reinforcements. We need to put Miles behind us first." They rode hard through the day, taking paths that seemed invisible to Lillian's untrained eye. By sunset, they'd reached a small creek fed by mountain springs. Bryce finally allowed them to stop, his face pale beneath his tan. "Now we see to that arm," Lillian insisted, helping him dismount. The bullet had carved a deep furrow along his bicep, the wound still seeping blood despite his makeshift bandage. "In my saddlebag," Bryce directed, sitting heavily on a fallen log. "Whiskey and a sewing kit." Lillian found the items and knelt beside him, her hands steadier than she'd expected. As a child, she'd often helped her physician father with minor procedures. Though her skills were rusty, they were better than nothing. "This will hurt," she warned, pouring whiskey over the wound. Bryce hissed but didn't pull away. "Been through worse." As Lillian stitched his arm with careful, small sutures, she asked the question that had been bothering her all day. "Why would you risk your life for me? You could have handed me over." Bryce watched her work, his blue eyes thoughtful. "Told you, everyone deserves a fresh start. You killed a man for me today." His expression remained steady. "I've killed before. Not proud of it, but sometimes there's no choice. That man would have dragged you back to worse than death." Lillian tied off the last stitch and wrapped clean cloth around his arm. "I have nowhere to go, no family left, no money of my own. My offer stands. You can stay at my ranch until you find your feet." He met her eyes directly. "No strings attached, Miss Davis. You'll have your own cabin, your own space. I employ several hands, including a married couple. Mrs. Patterson will be glad for female company." The generosity was overwhelming. "I don't know how I'd repay you. Ranch always needs an extra pair of hands. Can you cook?" Lillian nodded. "Yes, though not ranch style, I imagine." Bryce smiled, some color returning to his face. "Then you'll earn your keep. Mrs. Patterson will show you the ropes." He stood carefully, testing his arm. "We should make a cold camp tonight. No fire." They ate jerky and hardtack in the gathering darkness, speaking little. When it came time to sleep, Bryce gave Lillian his bedroll and kept first watch, his rifle across his knees. "I'll wake you in a few hours," he told her. "You know how to shoot?" Lillian shook her head. "I'll teach you tomorrow. Out here, everyone should know how to defend themselves." Wrapped in his coat and bedroll, Lillian watched the stars appear overhead. For the first time in years, despite the danger and uncertainty, she felt the stirring of something she'd almost forgotten: hope. The journey to Bryce's ranch took 5 days, riding through rugged country to avoid main trails where Caldwell's men might be looking. Each day brought new aches as Lillian's body adjusted to hours in the saddle, but she never complained. Each mile took her farther from her old life, and closer to whatever uncertain future awaited. By the 3rd day, Bryce was teaching her to shoot his spare revolver. Her first attempt sent bullets wild, but by the 5th day, she could hit a can at 10 paces more often than not. "You're a natural," Bryce commented, seeming genuinely impressed. "My father believed women should be able to protect themselves," Lillian explained, remembering her childhood lessons in Philadelphia. "Though he taught me anatomy rather than marksmanship." "Your father sounds like a wise man." "He was a doctor. He and my mother died in a typhoid outbreak when I was 20. That's when I came west to live with my uncle." Lillian reloaded the way Bryce had shown her. "Uncle Henry died last year. That's when Edward began his pursuit." Bryce's expression darkened. "Did your uncle arrange the match?" "No. He warned me about Edward actually, but I didn't listen. After Uncle Henry died, I had few options. Edward seemed respectable and I was alone." Lillian aimed and fired, the can jumping as her bullet struck it. "I was a fool. You were surviving. There's no shame in that." On the afternoon of the 5th day, they crested a ridge to reveal a valley below, nestled between pine-covered hills. A sturdy ranch house stood near a creek, with several outbuildings, corrals, and what looked like 20 or 30 head of cattle grazing in the distance. "Welcome to Whispering Pine Ranch," Bryce said, a note of pride in his voice. It wasn't large compared to some of the cattle operations Lillian had heard about, but everything looked well maintained. Smoke rose from the ranch house chimney, and as they rode closer, a weathered man with graying hair emerged, squinting up at them. "That's Hank Patterson, my foreman," Bryce explained. "Been with me since I started this place 8 years ago." Patterson's eyes widened as they approached, taking in Lillian's appearance, still wearing Bryce's oversized coat over her tattered dress and Bryce's bandaged arm. "Boss, we weren't expecting you for another week." Patterson called before tipping his hat to Lillian. "Madam." "Change of plans, Hank," Bryce said, dismounting and helping Lillian down. "This is Miss Lillian Davis. She'll be staying with us a while. Is Martha around?" As if summoned by her name, a plump, red-faced woman hurried from the ranch house, wiping her hands on her apron. Her gray-streaked brown hair was pulled back in a bun, and her eyes were sharp with curiosity. "Bryce O'Malley, you show up days early, wounded with a half-frozen young lady, and you don't even have the decency to send word ahead," she scolded, though her tone held more concern than anger. "Sorry, Martha. It was a bit of an emergency," Bryce said, gesturing to Lillian. "Miss Davis needs a safe place to stay. I thought the old trapper's cabin might suit her." Martha Patterson studied Lillian with shrewd eyes that softened as she took in her condition. "You poor dear. Come inside and get warm. We'll see to the cabin tomorrow. Tonight you need a hot bath, food, and rest." The ranch house was warm and smelled of fresh bread and beef stew. While Bryce explained the situation to his foreman in low tones, Martha led Lillian to a back bedroom and began filling a copper tub with hot water from kettles on the stove. "I've raised 5 children, dear, so there's nothing I haven't seen," Martha said kindly as she helped Lillian out of Bryce's coat and her ruined dress. Her expression hardened at the sight of the fading bruises on Lillian's ribs and arms. "The man who did this won't find me here," Lillian finished, stepping gingerly into the bath. "Good," Martha nodded firmly. "Bryce is a good man. If he brought you here, you're welcome to stay as long as you need." The hot water was bliss after days of Cold Creek washes. Martha provided clean undergarments, a simple brown skirt and a cream-colored blouse that was only slightly too large. "My daughter's things," she explained. "She's married and living in California now. She won't miss them." Clean, warm, and dressed in fresh clothes, Lillian felt human again for the first time in days. When she emerged into the main room, Bryce looked up from his conversation with Hank, his expression shifting to something Lillian couldn't quite name. "Feeling better?" he asked, standing politely. "Yes, thank you." Lillian clasped her hands, suddenly conscious of being the center of attention. "I don't know how to thank all of you." "No thanks needed," Hank said gruffly. "Boss says you're staying, so you're staying. Simple as that." Over dinner, Bryce explained that the trapper's cabin was about a quarter-mile from the main house near the creek. "It's not fancy, but it's solid. We use it for extra hands during roundup, but it's empty now." "I don't want to be a burden," Lillian began, but Martha cut her off. "Nonsense. That cabin's been sitting empty, gathering dust. Besides, I could use another woman around here. These men would live on beans and bacon if I let them." Later, as Martha showed Lillian to a small bedroom for the night, the older woman squeezed her hand. "Whatever you're running from, it's behind you now. Bryce O'Malley's word is iron in these parts. If he said you're safe here, then you are." The next morning, Lillian woke to the unfamiliar sounds of ranch life: roosters crowing, horses nickering, men calling to each other as they started their day. After weeks of living in Edward's grand house in Tombstone, under his increasingly controlling watch, the honest sounds of work and animals were refreshing. Martha provided her with a simple breakfast of eggs, bacon, and biscuits, then showed her to the kitchen garden where they picked winter greens for the evening meal. "Ranch work is hard, but there's a rhythm to it," Martha explained, showing Lillian how to tell which greens were still good despite the cold. "Summer's busiest with the garden and preserving, winter's for mending and indoor work. Spring and fall are cattle time, that's when the men are busiest and dirtiest." By midday, Bryce and Hank had prepared the trapper's cabin. Lillian walked with them to see her new home. The cabin was small but sturdy, with a stone fireplace, A wooden bed frame with a fresh straw mattress, a table with 2 chairs, and a few shelves built into the walls. Windows on either side let in plenty of light, and a small porch overlooked the creek. "It's perfect," Lillian said honestly, running her hand over the rough-hewn table. After Edward's opulent house, the cabin's simplicity felt like freedom rather than deprivation. "Martha's sending over some linens and kitchen things," Bryce said, lighting a fire in the fireplace to take the chill off. "And I thought you might need these." From behind the door, he produced several packages wrapped in brown paper. "Ordered some supplies from Prescott before I left. Figured they might suit you better than Martha's daughter's hand-me-downs, though you're welcome to those too." Inside the packages, Lillian found 2 work dresses, a warmer skirt, blouses, undergarments, a warm shawl, and a pair of sturdy boots. Tears sprang to her eyes at the thoughtfulness. "How did you know my size?" Bryce looked embarrassed. "Guessed. Martha helped when I described you in my letter ahead." "Thank you," Lillian said, touching the simple, practical clothes with appreciation. "I'll repay you for these." "Consider it part of your wages," Bryce said. "Martha's getting older and could use help with the cooking and household. If you're willing, that is." "Of course," Lillian agreed quickly. "I want to earn my keep." Hank cleared his throat. "Boss, we should check that south fence line before dark." After they left, Lillian arranged her new possessions carefully in the small cabin. For the first time in years, she had a space that was truly hers, without the shadow of obligation or fear. That evening, she joined the ranch household for dinner. Bryce, the Pattersons, and 3 cowboys named Miguel, Charlie, and Finn. They were polite but curious about her, though no one asked direct questions about why she'd arrived with Bryce in such circumstances. The following weeks fell into a pattern. Lillian helped Martha with cooking, cleaning, and mending for the ranch hands. She learned to make sourdough bread, render lard, and preserve meat. The work was harder than anything she'd done in Philadelphia or Tombstone, but satisfying in its tangible results. Bryce was often away checking fences, moving cattle, or handling ranch business, but he made a point to stop by her cabin every few days, sometimes bringing small gifts, a book he thought she might like, wildflowers in spring, or once, a kitten from a barn litter that now kept her cabin free of mice. "You're settling in well," he commented one evening in late April as they sat on her porch watching the sunset. 4 months had passed since her desperate flight from Tombstone, and with each day, that life seemed more distant. "I never thought I could be happy with so little," Lillian admitted, watching swallows dart over the creek. "In Philadelphia, we had servants. In Tombstone, Edward showered me with expensive gifts, but I was never content. And now," Lillian smiled, "now I have work that matters, people who respect me, and no one telling me how to speak or dress or think." She glanced at him. "You gave me more than a coat and a fresh start, Bryce. You gave me myself back." He looked away, something unreadable crossing his features. "You did that yourself. You were brave enough to run that night." A comfortable silence fell between them. These quiet evenings had become precious to Lillian, a time when she could speak freely without fear of judgment. She'd learned much about Bryce during these conversations: how he'd come west with his mother at 12, after they fled his abusive father in Boston. How he'd worked cattle since he was 14, saving every penny until he could buy this land at 23. "Any news from Prescott?" she asked eventually. Bryce nodded. "Stopped by the sheriff's office while I was there. No wanted posters or inquiries about a missing woman from Tombstone." "That's surprising. I would have thought Edward would have half the territory looking for me." "Maybe he doesn't want people knowing his bride to be fled." Bryce's tone was carefully neutral. "Men like that care about their reputation." "Or maybe he found someone else to torment," Lillian said softly, Bryce's hand covered hers briefly. Either way, you're safe here. As spring turned to summer, Lillian's days grew busier. The garden demanded attention, and with Roundup approaching, there was extra cooking and preparations to be done. She'd grown stronger, her skin tanned from outdoor work, her hands calloused but capable. One hot July afternoon, as she was gathering eggs in the henhouse, a horse's whinny alerted her to visitors. Stepping outside, she saw two riders approaching the main house. One was the Prescott sheriff, whom she recognized from town visits. The other made her blood run cold. Edward Caldwell sat tall in the saddle, his expensive suit and groomed appearance out of place on the working ranch. Even at this distance, Lillian could see the cold determination in his posture. Heart pounding, she slipped back into the henhouse and out the rear door, then ran for the cover of trees along the creek. From there, she could see the main house without being seen. Bryce was away checking cattle with Miguel and Charlie. Only Hank and Martha were at the house, with Finn working in the nearby barn. Edward and the sheriff dismounted and Martha came to the door. Even from a distance, Lillian could see Martha's stance grow defensive. Hank appeared from the barn, rifle in hand, though he kept it pointed down. Words were exchanged that Lillian couldn't hear. The sheriff showed some papers. Martha shook her head firmly. Edward's voice rose, though the words remained indistinct. Then he pointed directly toward Lillian's cabin. Terror gripped her. Somehow he'd found her. The sheriff's presence suggested he had legal grounds to take her back, perhaps claiming she'd stolen property, or that she was mentally unstable. Such tactics weren't uncommon for men of Edward's standing. Lillian retreated further into the trees, mind racing. She could run again, but where? Without money or supplies, she wouldn't last long. And this time, there might not be a Bryce O'Malley to save her. As she debated, the sound of approaching hoofbeats made her press against a tree trunk. Relief flooded through her when she saw it was Bryce, returning early from his rounds. He rode straight to the house, obviously alerted by one of the hands. Bryce dismounted in one fluid motion, stepping between Edward and the house. Even from her hiding place, Lillian could see the tension in his shoulders. Words were exchanged, Bryce's head shaking firmly. The sheriff looked uncomfortable, showing his papers again. Edward suddenly pointed toward the creek toward her. All three men looked in her direction. Lillian froze, unsure whether she'd been spotted. Then Bryce did something unexpected. He laughed. The sound carried across the yard, followed by his voice, loud enough now for her to hear snippets. "Welcome to search. Nothing to hide." Edward and the sheriff followed Bryce toward her cabin. Lillian pressed deeper into the trees, working her way along the creek until she reached a bend that hid her from view. There, she waited, heart hammering. Nearly half an hour passed before she heard approaching footsteps. Grabbing a fallen branch for defense, she backed against a tree. "Lillian." Bryce's voice called softly. "It's me, you're safe." She stepped out cautiously. "Edward, gone, sheriff too." Bryce's expression was grim. "He had a marriage certificate, claims you're his wife and fled with family heirlooms." "That's a lie. We were to be married the day after I ran. And I took nothing but the clothes I wore." Panic rose in her throat. Did the sheriff believe him? Doesn't matter what he believes. Caldwell's got no authority here. This is Yavapai County, not Cochise. Bryce took her trembling hands in his. "I told them I'd never heard of Lillian Davis. That the woman staying in my cabin is my wife's cousin, Laura Donovan, who came from back east after being widowed." Lillian blinked. "Your wife?" "I may have implied I had one." Bryce's mouth quirked. "Sheriff's new to the territory, doesn't know me well enough to call the bluff." And Edward believed that. Not entirely, but he couldn't prove otherwise. "I invited them to search the property, knowing you'd have the sense to hide." He squeezed her hands. "But Lillian, he won't give up easily, not a man like that." "What do I do?" Bryce led her to a fallen log and they sat. "You have choices. You could leave, head to California or even back east where he'd have trouble finding you." The thought of leaving the safety and contentment she'd found at Whispering Pine made Lillian's chest tighten. "And my other choices. You stay, but as Laura Donovan. We maintain the story." Bryce ran a hand through his hair, looking uncharacteristically nervous. "There's a third option, but I hesitate to suggest it." "Tell me." After everything he'd done for her, Lillian trusted Bryce's judgment completely. Marriage. The word hung in the air between them. "A real one, not just a story. As my wife, you'd have legal protection. Caldwell couldn't touch you without going through me first." Lillian stared at him, stunned. "You would marry me, just to protect me." "Not just for that." Bryce met her eyes directly. "I care for you, Lillian. More than I should, perhaps. These past months, watching you build a life here, seeing your strength and kindness. I'd be honored to have you as my wife, but I won't use your situation to pressure you." The confession stole Lillian's breath. She'd been so focused on building her independence, on healing from Edward's cruelty, that she'd pushed aside the growing warmth she felt in Bryce's presence. The anticipation when he visited her cabin. The way his rare smiles made her heart skip. "You would truly want me, after everything." Bryce touched her cheek gently. "I've wanted you since that night by the campfire when you stitched my arm without flinching and told me about your father teaching you anatomy instead of shooting. But I promised you a fresh start with no strings attached, and I meant it." Lillian covered his hand with hers. "And if I wanted those strings," hope flared in his eyes, "then I'd be the luckiest man in the Arizona Territory." That evening they sat with the Pattersons and explained the situation. Martha was unsurprised by the revelation of Bryce's feelings. "Been watching you moon over her for months," she told him with a snort. "About time you spoke up." The wedding took place 3 days later, performed by a circuit preacher who happened to be passing through. The entire ranch turned out the Hands, the Pattersons, and even a few neighboring ranchers Bryce counted as friends. Lillian wore a simple blue dress Martha had helped her make, with wildflowers in her hair. Bryce wore his best shirt and a new waistcoat, his sandy hair slicked back with water. When he took her hands before the preacher, his eyes never left hers. "I, Bryce, take you, Lillian, to be my lawfully wedded wife," he vowed, his voice steady and sure. "To have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do us part." When Lillian repeated the vows, she meant every word. This was no marriage of convenience or protection, though it had begun that way. Somewhere between that desperate night in the desert and today, love had grown like the wildflowers after spring rain, quietly but persistently, until it couldn't be ignored. After a celebration that lasted well into the night, with fiddle music, dancing, and more food than the small ranch had likely ever seen at once, Bryce led Lillian to the main house. "I thought we might stay here tonight," he said, a question in his voice. "The Hands know not to disturb us until late tomorrow." Lillian nodded, suddenly shy despite the certainty of her feelings. "And after, your choice. We can stay here or in your cabin or build something new, whatever makes you happy." Inside, Bryce had prepared a surprise. The main room was lit with candles, and a small box sat on the table. "A wedding gift," he explained, gesturing for her to open it. Inside was a delicate silver locket. When Lillian opened it, she found a tiny painted wildflower like the ones that had been blooming the night she fled. "To remember how far you've come," Bryce said softly, helping her fasten it around her neck. Lillian touched it with trembling fingers. "I don't need reminders of that night anymore, only of what came after." She stepped closer, hesitating only briefly before reaching up to touch his face. Bryce remained still, letting her take the lead. When she rose on tiptoes to kiss him, his arms encircled her waist with gentle restraint. "I won't ever hurt you," he promised against her lips. "I know." Lillian looked into his eyes, seeing only love and respect where once she'd expected to find control and cruelty. "That's why I love you." Their life together began that night, not with demands or expectations, but with tender discovery and mutual respect. Bryce's touch was gentle, his patience endless as he helped Lillian reclaim intimacy on her own terms. In the morning light, she watched him sleep. This man who had given her his coat on a cold desert night and then proceeded to give her everything else she needed: safety, respect, purpose, and finally, love. The debt could never be repaid, but as his wife, she'd spend a lifetime trying. News traveled slowly in the territory, but by the end of summer, word reached them that Edward Caldwell had suffered financial reversals. His main silver mine had flooded, and investors had pulled out after rumors of mismanagement. The last they heard, he'd returned east in disgrace. "Seems fitting," Bryce commented when the news arrived. "Men like that always believe they are untouchable." Lillian just nodded, feeling the last chains of fear finally break. Edward no longer had power over her future or her nightmares. As autumn painted the hills in gold and crimson, Lillian discovered she was with child. When she told Bryce, his face lit with a joy she'd never seen before. "A family," he whispered, placing his hand gently on her still flat stomach. "Our family." The pregnancy progressed well through the winter months. Martha fussed over Lillian constantly, insisting she rest more and teaching her everything she knew about childbirth and infant care. "5 children I've birthed and helped a dozen more into the world," Martha assured her when Lillian expressed fears. "Women have been doing this since Eve, my dear. Your body knows what to do." On a bright spring morning in April 1885, almost 18 months after Lillian had fled Tombstone with only the clothes on her back, their son was born after a difficult but ultimately successful labor. They named him Henry Hank O'Malley, after Lillian's uncle and Bryce's loyal foreman. "He has your eyes," Bryce marveled, holding his son with careful hands that had broken horses and built fences but now cradled new life with infinite tenderness. "And your chin," Lillian observed, exhausted but radiant. As little Henry grew, so did Whispering Pine Ranch. With careful management and some lucky investments, Bryce was able to buy adjoining land and increase their herd. Lillian proved to have a good head for figures and helped with the ranch accounts, freeing Bryce to focus on the physical work he preferred. When Henry was 2, they welcomed a daughter, Sarah Martha O'Malley. The Pattersons were honorary grandparents to both children, teaching Henry to ride almost before he could walk and showing Sarah how to gather eggs without frightening the hens. On the 5th anniversary of their wedding, Bryce surprised Lillian with a trip to San Francisco, a city neither had visited. They left the children with the Pattersons and spent 2 glorious weeks exploring the vibrant coastal city, staying in a fine hotel, attending the theater, and walking along the harbor. "Did you ever imagine this life?" Bryce asked one evening as they stood on their hotel balcony, watching the sunset over the bay. "That night when you ran," Lillian leaned against his solid warmth. "I couldn't imagine anything beyond surviving the night." She turned in his arms, looking up at the face she'd grown to love more with each passing day. "You gave me so much more than survival, Bryce. You gave me a life worth living." "You built that life yourself," he countered, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I just provided the land to build it on. And the coat," she reminded him with a smile. "Don't forget the coat," he laughed, the sound still her favorite in the world, And the coat, best investment I ever made. When they returned to Whispering Pine, life resumed its pleasant rhythm. The children grew, the ranch prospered, and their love deepened with shared joys and challenges. They built a new, larger house to accommodate their growing family, though Lillian insisted they keep her original cabin standing. "It was my first real home," she explained, "where I learned I could stand on my own." In 1893, 10 years after Lillian had fled Tombstone, they received an unexpected visitor. A young woman arrived at the ranch, thin and tired, with a bruised face half hidden beneath her bonnet. She asked for work, her voice barely above a whisper. Lillian recognized the look in her eyes immediately, the same desperate fear she'd once carried. That evening, after settling their visitor in the old trapper's cabin with food and clean clothes, Lillian found Bryce in their bedroom, removing his boots after a long day. "She's running from someone," Lillian said quietly. "A husband, I think." Bryce nodded, unsurprised. "I figured as much. What do you want to do? Give her a job, a place to stay, time to heal?" Lillian sat beside him, taking his weathered hand in hers. "Someone once did that for me." Bryce smiled, lifting their joined hands to kiss her knuckles. "Seems only right to pass it on." As years turned to decades, Whispering Pine Ranch became known as a place where second chances were possible. Not every broken soul who found their way there stayed permanently, but all received the same gifts. Lillian had once been given: shelter, respect, and the opportunity for a fresh start. Henry grew up to take over much of the ranch management, while Sarah surprised everyone by studying medicine and becoming one of Arizona's first female doctors. Both children married and gave Bryce and Lillian grandchildren who filled the ranch with laughter during their frequent visits. On cold winter nights, Bryce and Lillian often sat before their fireplace, her head on his shoulder, as they reminisced about the years behind and planned for those ahead. "Remember that sheepskin coat?" Lillian asked one such evening as their 50th wedding anniversary approached. "The one you gave me that first night. Still have it," Bryce admitted with a chuckle. "It's in that trunk in the storeroom. Too worn for wearing now, but I couldn't bring myself to throw it away." "Fetch it for me," Lillian requested. Bryce returned with the ancient coat, its sheepskin lining yellow with age, the leather cracked and stiff. Lillian ran her fingers over it reverently. "This coat changed everything," she murmured. "One act of kindness that altered the course of 2 lives." "Not the coat," Bryce corrected gently. "Your courage to run, to trust, to build something new." "Together," Lillian added, leaning against the man who had been her protector, partner, and greatest love for half a century. "We built it together." Outside, snow began to fall on Whispering Pine Ranch, covering the land they'd nurtured in a blanket of white. Inside, warmed by fire and memories, Bryce O'Malley held his wife close, marveling at how a desperate night and a simple coat had led to a lifetime of love neither could have imagined on that cold December night in 1883. "Together," he agreed, pressing a kiss to her silver hair. "Always together."